Now, the third G20 finance ministers and central bank governors meeting under the Indian Presidency was being held between the 17th and 18th of July in Gandhinagar. It has concluded. It was attended by finance ministers and central bank heads of G20 member nations, which includes, of course, the US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen was there. So was the Chinese finance minister. Diverse topics of discussions, those range from economic development to health infrastructure, from debt distressing to control on tax evasion by big corporations, from infrastructure investment to financial independence. Big topics all. But despite several meetings, several statements, the question remains, can a group of such diverse nations agree on global issues that affect each other? Can countries like China and India and US and France, can all of them come together on this single platform that is called G20, setting aside their own bilateral issues? We'll delve into that discussion after this short report. Also listen in to key takeaways from the meeting. Of course, the finance minister spoke at the end of the G20 meeting in Gandhinagar. This is what we came away with.
Members appreciated the significant progress made in respect to the two-pillar international taxation package. Members also welcomed a plan for additional support and technical assistance for developing countries and discussed the need to ensure that G20 efforts to enhance tax transparency translate into effective outcomes. There was, of course, a high-level tax symposium on combating tax evasion, corruption, money laundering, and so on. The panelists were also from FATF, OECD, and the European Commission for Economy and Finance Minister of Indonesia. Each one, of course, had a lot of pith and substance in the discussion. The next issue I go on to is the financial sector issues. Members deliberated on the macro, financial, and regulatory challenges posed by crypto assets ecosystem and on the potential global policy responses which are so required. So when I said financial sector issues, it pertains to the crypto issues. Members welcomed the high-level recommendations of the FSB on crypto asset activities and also the global stablecoin arrangements. Members also discussed the presidency note that India had prepared and noted that it would be an important input towards prioritizing areas of work essential for achieving a comprehensive, cohesive, and coordinated global policy and regulatory framework. Funding of cities of tomorrow. There was a lot of interest, lot of constructive suggestions. There was a strong support for the work under the India presidency on prioritizing financing of cities of tomorrow. The principles designed by the Indian presidency will enable cities to develop customized policies that encourage alternative financing sources also. There was an infrastructure investors dialogue on leveraging funding and financing mechanisms and approaches for cities of tomorrow, which was held on the 16th of July.
There is a lot of attention to the agenda items of what was discussed and also the use of the word welcomed. But what is sorely missing seems to be the word consensus. To break down the variety of agenda items at this last G20 meeting that has taken place, what it has been able to achieve, and of course to understand the repercussions as far as possibilities that exist in future G20 meetings. Let's discuss it with senior journalist Madhavan Narayan is joining us. Also, former Ambassador Meera Shankar. Bandhan Bank's Chief Economist Siddharth Sanyal is with us as well. And for the international tax expertise, we're leaning towards TP Oswal, who's with us tonight. Welcome to India Development Debate and a very good evening to you all. Madhavan Narayan, to you first. It was in February this year that we had a meeting of the G20 finance chiefs in Bangalore, and it ended without a consensus statement. The prime reason, of course, was Russia and China objecting to the description of the war in Ukraine in a final draft of that document. Now, at the end of the Gandhinagar G20 meeting, is it becoming clearer what this bloc can do and what it just cannot accomplish? Is it becoming clear?
Well, it seems like the other day that I was there with Ambassador Meera Shankar in Germany when India was just a bystander in a G13 meeting. Things have moved very fast as far as India's membership and leadership is concerned. But we've also, it seems, G20 as a group bitten off much more than it can chew. And ironically, at a time when the agenda is getting more skewed by the elephant in the room, which is actually the Ukraine war or the Russia-Ukraine war. And so we are actually talking about a situation, I call it love in the times of cholera, as in there is so much of ambitious programs being worked in at a time when there is a fundamental trust deficit between member countries, especially China and Russia, as you yourself pointed out. But having said that, we are in a world in which the interconnectedness is something that the planet has never seen before. Whether you're talking about the internet connecting technologies, trade that has created value networks of manufacturing across, so that if you touch one, you touch all, and if one is to progress, all must progress. Therefore, to that extent, G20 has become much more than an elite club. It's become something that sets the agenda as well as drives the goals. But what has happened is that there is much more to it today than the simple old macroeconomic related goals. Security has become complicated, as we know, by what is going on in NATO, and that has a knock-off effect on the economy worldwide. And then we have things like digital currency as well as cryptocurrency. Then we have taxation of global giants like Google or Microsoft, as well as separate issues related to regulation, whether it is on artificial intelligence or it is what you call taxation, as well as some of the issues related to unbundling and bundling of various services. So it's actually a great amount of workman-like things needed, involving experts of various kinds. And I didn't even mention climate change, which remains a monster, which seems to be running, heat wave in the floods in India, the heat wave in Southern Europe. Doesn't seem to bother global leaders, and they are fighting a vain war. So there's been a lot of, it's like you can say it's 3 steps forward and 2 steps backward.
Let me take that across to Meera Shankar. Meera Shankar, like Madhavan Narayan is pointing out, do you think the G20 has bitten off more than it can chew? Because these are great agenda items, a great platform for countries to start thinking together and finding solutions. But working towards a solution comes with its own pack of problems, because you find very diverse countries sitting together, and India and China, for example, with the United States. So as far as India's stewardship is concerned, it is going to reflect on its presidency as well, what the G20 is able to achieve this year or not. How much do you agree that it is going to reflect on what India's stewardship has yielded so far?
Well, it's always complex to reach consensus in large international groupings, especially where it is, not a harmonious grouping at one level of economic development, but reflects countries which have divergent levels of economic development, therefore divergent national interests in the way they see the world. But I think these are all worthwhile issues to discuss. Eventually, the consensus may narrow down to 1 or 2 major themes. For instance, there is probably enough support for reforming international development banks and increasing the amount of concessional finance which might be available for infrastructure development or for the energy transition in developing countries. So I don't see that as being such a major issue where it would not be possible to arrive at a consensus. The second area where I think there's a possibility of progress is on the question of debt restructuring, because so many of the low-income and middle-income countries are facing huge levels of unsustainable debt.
Yes.
Several of them defaulted, Sri Lanka,
Yes.
Ghana. Before that, I think Zimbabwe or some other country
But
had
that's
defaulted.
the important part, ma'am. Why have we not been able to move ahead on that front? Perhaps Siddharth will be able to help us with this. Siddharth Sanyal, a lot of the talks at this third finance meeting revolved around debt restructuring of vulnerable countries. Zambia got a deal to restructure its debt of $6.3 billion, and this only happened last month. But the G20 isn't convinced of taking that as perhaps a benchmark. What are the roadblocks on arriving at a consensus on the subject of debt restructuring, you think? Within the bloc, why is it so difficult to arrive at a way ahead on how to serve countries that really need that financial aid?
Some of these issues, as my esteemed co-panelists also mentioned very, very clearly, these are some of the tremendously interlinked issues, and immediate interest of some of the countries might be moving in different directions. Not only in case of the issue related to debt levels or debt restructuring in case of certain countries or a block of countries. I think a lot of issues might have some immediate or apparent conflicts between countries. So it's not really. It may take a bit of a time in terms of progress towards a mutually exclusive or widely acceptable solution. But having said that, I think some of the progresses that some of the areas on which we have made tremendous progress over the course of the last few months are really, really noteworthy. First and foremost, that comes to my mind, this particular discussion about multilateral development banks. I think this particular focus is really welcome. Also, the great focus or some kind of an anchor theme, which is emerging in the form of multilateral discussion in terms of dealing with climatic changes related issues. I think these are some of the areas, and some of the issues that are being discussed can actually be mutually interlinked. So I think that's a tremendous progress that we have witnessed over the course of the last 3 months. So rather than why it has taken so much time, the progress that we have made, I would like to see as a glass more than half full rather than some part is still not full.
Mr. Oswal, do you agree? Do you see this as a glass half full at this point in time? Discussions have been happening, but post-pandemic, we've seen Sri Lanka, Ghana default on their debts last year. Zambia, of course, defaulted about 2 odd years before that. But we're living in a time where more than half of all low-income countries are facing debt concerns in one way or another, which also means that their long-term ability to function and develop is getting hampered. So are there too many distinctively country-wise reasons for debt stress? Or is there, you think, a deeper problem that low-income countries are facing that can be addressed by a bloc like the G20, and we are moving in that direction? Mr. Oswal.
Well, it is impossible to resolve all the problems at a time. But if there is a consensus to resolve the problem, and if the developed countries or 19 G20 group of countries, which controls 85% of the trade in the world, possibly if they want to help, yes, they can. But the question arises is, what is the guarantee that they will get back the money? And therefore, for example, China has been investing all these countries earlier, and now the number of countries have started defaulting Chinese debts. And that has caused a lot of issues for China. And therefore, it will be a cautious approach people will have to adopt. and then accordingly, then only the matter will progress further. Otherwise, it is going to be a challenging task. However, if the country is concerned, for example, multilateral agencies like IMF or World Bank agrees to fund these countries, then it is possible. For example, some funds were made available by IMF to Pakistan just last week. Otherwise, that country was absolutely holding a begging bowl in the hand. They had no monies to even meet the day-to-day expenditure for import of the goods. And that was a problem. So therefore, similar situation does arise in the case of all the developing countries. And particularly, you have given the few names, which is the reality of the life.
It certainly seems so. And since you're talking about multilateral development banks, it has been said at the meeting that these MDBs, multilateral development banks, they need nearly $3 trillion of an additional spend a year until 2030. I want to ask you, Madhavan Narayan, do you see that possible? Even with private sector participation that Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman has spoken about, do you think that's something that can be achieved?
I think let's first look at the intent behind this, Vikram. The intent behind this is to take the global economy away from the old-fashioned IMF, World Bank, Bretton Woods kind of equation where the US practically controlled the strings. We need to have a multilateral approach so that we need to finance global economic development through a certain consensus-based approach, which is more equitable, more fair, and with a certain amount of participatory muscle from everybody. Having said that, let me look at the target. The 3 trillion is a number. We could put it at 4 trillion and 2 trillion. It's more like an aspirational goal. We call it the stretch goal. The real question is, how are we going to actually execute this? Who's going to have what kind of voting power? What will be the basis of the loan? You yourself mentioned Zambia and Sri Lanka are defaulters. Funnily enough, when individuals default, they go to jail, or it's called a moral hazard problem in micro-level banking. But when countries default, it seems like the lender is the one to blame. We've seen it in the case of Greece when Brexit happened or almost happened. So we also at the G20 level need a new kind of banking morality to start with for international finance, so that some of the debt, if you look at the history of debt in the world, it's not always the borrowing country that is to be blamed. Global capitalism is sort of reckless in the way it lends, and then it ends up, blaming the borrower, because a lot of countries that borrow do not have stable fiscal as well as politically sound economic systems. So any multilateral effort must include all of this, if you ask me. As far as the number is concerned, any number is good. I believe in, banks can grow. You can start somewhere. You can start with even $500 billion and then stretch it to 3 trillion. Nothing stops you from, growing over time.
Right.
But I think these numbers are put essentially to give momentum to the whole thing as a big idea so that more countries will participate in the development. This is my understanding.
Right.
But all said and done, a lot of these G20 issues are increasingly less at the summit level, not even at the media level, if you ask me. It involves diplomats, economists, and policy makers. In fact, I'd like to call them policy designers, because some of these issues are becoming so complicated.
They are.
That you need to sit down and work it out. So we need a WTO-like mechanism for some of the G20 issues. For WTO has a fully fledged back office which considers a lot of these issues.
Yes.
We don't have that kind of a thing for G20. Maybe it's time to think on those lines.
But the economic challenges faced by different countries, those can be unique as well. And this meeting of the G20 has been marked by low attendance as well. Like Argentina, like Brazil, France, Mexico, they sent their junior level officials, we understand. That's what we're picking up from reports. The German and British ministers did not attend, though, of course, Germany's central bank chief was there. But this low attendance has certainly dampened perhaps some of that sentiment on decision making. That's something that you need more of. Of course, the US was present, the largest delegation under the leadership of the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. And now in the wake of renewed Indo-US ties, Meera Shankar, amidst those strained ties with China, how is the American participation in the G20's meeting in Gandhinagar to be seen? In fact, Yellen has said that the US is now looking ahead to working with India on what she said is an investment platform to deliver a low cost of capital and increase private investment to speed India's energy transition. How do you read into that?
I think it's very positive. The US is signaling that they attach importance to India, with the presence of the US Treasury Secretary, and she comes with a positive agenda, not just with regard to India, but even on the other issues, because when Secretary of State Antony Blinken was here, I remember that he said that the US also agrees, because Ukraine was taking away a lot of the focus of G20, and India was stressing that we need to focus on issues of concern to developing countries and the world, rather than just get bogged down in geostrategic or conflict differences. And the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said, yes, the US would be prepared to work constructively on these issues. And clearly, these are challenges which face the world. We were talking about, the debt of low-income or middle-income countries. Now, sometimes it's also, as was said earlier, that the lending terms, as from China, have been, quite rapacious and then not transparent.
Right.
Secondly, many of these countries have faced one knock after another, with the pandemic seriously impacting their economies. For instance, for Sri Lanka,
yes,
tourism was a major source of income and foreign exchange. And because of the Easter terrorist bombings, then followed by the pandemic,
yes,
tourism collapsed.
Right.
And that meant that Sri Lanka's ability to earn also collapsed. And now, after that, they're facing the challenges caused by the war in Ukraine and high energy prices, high food prices, scarcity of food. We just read again
yes,
that Russia has walked out of the grain deal,
exactly,
which was permitting export of Ukraine.
But ma'am, if you heard the Sherpa speaking at the start of this meeting, they're talking about not delving too much into finding a consensus on ways to end the war. That is not within the remit of the G20. The fallout of the war, as far as that is concerned, is something that the entire bloc is facing. Of course, you have a pandemic that you're talking about, but there are things that this set of countries can actually work on and achieve, and that depends on a geopolitical event that is currently on and is showing no signs of ending. But even so, what about India's ability, as it has been the presidency as far as the G20 this year is concerned, its ability to draw investments from member G20 countries? That is something that they have been able to dip into. Canada sounding keen on putting in their pension money in India's infrastructure bonds. That's a narrative, and that has been pushed aggressively. The adoption of the Indian currency, UPI in France, made headlines when the Prime Minister spoke about paying in INR to get atop the Eiffel Tower. And yesterday we heard from the ECB as well at the G20 meeting, lauding India's strides in digital payments. Are these opportunities being dipped into enough, according to you, as far as, the possibilities of growth for the Indian economy are concerned, Siddharth? Do you think we've managed to do that enough, because we are drawing to the end of the presidency in November?
I think the momentum has been created. And I think, Vikram, you touched upon a couple of extremely important areas. I'm not too sure whether it's adequately appreciated that the digital public infrastructure in case of India arguably is is possibly one of the best in the world, potentially even the best in the world today. So I think going ahead, when there is a lot of emphasis on this particular area, India will tend to enjoy a huge advantage on this particular issue. We are seeing a steady shift of services sector firms and service export potential in case of India it's moving from some of the other geographies and locations and often from very advanced geographies and advanced economies to India in a very steady fashion. Also, even in case of manufacturing exports, we are seeing India scaling up the value chain. It's no longer the story of just talking about some of the primary commodity exports or something of that sort. But rather than that, you tend to export a lot of high-end petrochemical products, a lot of high-end engineering products, and this is positioning India in a very different way. On top of that, this particular round of G20 possibly has been a huge tool or huge event in terms of showcasing some of the progresses, showcasing India's ability to strike a very meaningful conversation from a leadership position across various countries from various geographies and various socio-economic strata. I think overall, thus, what India has achieved, apart from the achievement of the overall G20 bloc, I think is mighty meaningful and will possibly have a very significant dividend that will be reaped over the course of the next 5 to 10 years.
We will have to see exactly what the Leaders' Summit unfolds. As far as a consensus is concerned, that is something that has eluded it so far. But how much more is going to be achieved remains to be seen, whether it's on common norms within the G20 when it comes to cryptos. Because even within India, as far as the RBI is concerned, they would want to ban it. The government is looking for a regulatory framework, which we don't have yet. But can it happen within the G20 is something that we're looking forward to. Another aspect is, of course, the two-pillar taxation system. Now, is that something that will come through as well? There are so many moving pieces, climate funding being another, but how much progress is going to be made in how much time? That's what the world is watching. That's what we're watching very closely. Madhavan Narayan, Meera Shankar, Siddharth Sanyal and Mr. TP Oswal. Thank you very much for joining us with your perspective on this edition of India Development Debate. Always a pleasure getting your views. With that, it's going to be a wrap. Of course, we'll see you same time tomorrow. Until then, do take care. Good night.